history of the organization, what we do, and how our organization is sort of linked to the themes that were mentioned in the beginning, like popular education. But primarily we are a community organizing project in a mass-based newspaper. The two components of our activities are, again, putting out a mass-based newspaper that is used as an organizing tool in communities throughout the city, and the other one being our members have to undergo regular political education so that we can reflect theories that have worked in the past in other movements in our own practice and improve our own work. So I'm just going to get into a little bit more detail there. Basically, and you're probably going to notice I'm going to say that word a lot. It might get confusing since that's the name of our paper. But basically, we began a few years ago when a group of organizers across the city who were a little bit disillusioned with the organizations that they were part of decided that there were a few gaps in what they were seeing in the city in terms of organizing masses, tools to organize masses, and how organizations were outreaching into different communities in the city. One of the common themes running throughout all of their sort of disillusionment and frustration was that the organizations they were part of, they didn't really see as mass-based. And what I mean by mass-based is that they weren't necessarily coming out of the communities or groups that they were purporting to organize. So it seemed more like people were going into communities or saying there was a need, we have to go into a community, we have to try to outreach to them. These are what we think their issues are, rather than people in the communities organizing themselves and changing their communities from within. That was one major frustration. Another one was that there was definitely a lack of consistent political education. So there were a lot of organizations that were acting. They were doing a lot of things. It's not that they weren't acting, they weren't active, they weren't activists. They were. But what was missing was sort of the theory to back up their practice. So why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we doing it this way? Why aren't we doing it this other way? Are we learning from previous examples? Are we learning from other historical movements that have been successful or unsuccessful? So they found that there was a definite lack when it came to educating themselves about previous political movements and theories that had been both successful and also that had been unsuccessful, and how we could sort of look at adapting those lessons to our own work and our own practice. And the third gap that they identified was that there was an absence of a tool, an actual tool that people could use to organize themselves. And so what ended up happening is they did a little bit of research, and it didn't take too long. A lot of people think that it was a long, arduous process, that they sat for many, many months on end, and they sort of, did tons of reading and political education. Yes, that was there, but there was also just like, okay, let's look at what has happened in the past. What has worked in the past? And they looked at historical examples, to cite a North American one, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. What did they use to organize the masses? What did they use? One of their primary tools was a mass-based newspaper, right? They used that newspaper to tell the stories of the communities that they were in, and they used that newspaper to share those stories with other community members so that community members could organize themselves to change their lot, right? So we thought, okay, why don't we try this out in some of the communities that we're present in? So one of our first campaigns was based out of the Lawrence Heights community. This was the sort of first campaign that Basics began to support. Just to give you a brief history of what was happening in Lawrence Heights and what is continuing to happen today, Lawrence Heights is a community that's located just south of Yorkdale Mall, for those of you who aren't familiar with the city, Lawrence West Subway Station. And right now it's undergoing a process of what is called by the City of Toronto and Toronto Community Housing revitalization. So what that means basically in reality is that people's houses that they've lived in for many, many, many years are being torn down to be replaced by what they're calling mixed income housing, which really means large condominiums where there is a very, very, very small percentage of rent geared to income or affordable housing. And they're hoping to attract a different class of people to the And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of, and is causing a lot of problems within the community because it's basically destroying the community from within. I'm not going to get into the details of how TCHC, which is Toronto Community Housing, and the city are carrying out this basically community massacre. But what we saw was that there was no way for community members in that community to organize themselves against that onslaught. Okay? There was no independent, mass-based tenant organization to counter all of the claims of all the positive and wonderful things that revitalization would bring to the community. There was no way for community members to express themselves and to say, no, we don't want to do this. What we did notice, however, because we did have members living in the community, is that every time we went to a community forum, there was a profound sense of anger and distrust when it came to Toronto Community Housing and what was going on. People were angry because they weren't being told what was happening in their community. People were angry because repairs weren't getting done in their buildings, so they were forced to leave. People were angry because there was no outlet for them to come together and organize, no space. Their community was essentially being destroyed. So we decided to start holding meetings with tenants. We decided to start using the newspaper to tell these tenants' stories. And some of the other things we did was we organized legal clinics with lawyers in the community that we knew to provide legal help for those that wanted to fight back against TCHC and argue that their living standards were actually a human rights violation and that TCHC should be forced to carry out repairs, and in some cases we were successful. Now our work in Lawrence Heights is still ongoing, and because it was our first project, it has in some ways been one of our slowest moving projects. But we did take a lot out of this experience. One of the things that is interesting to note, I'm just going to tell you a little anecdote. Steve over here, he recently was at a meeting and he ran into a young man who was from the community in Lawrence Heights. They just happened to start talking, and Steve mentioned that he was pretty familiar with that community. He said, "Oh really? I used to work there," this young man. He said, "I used to work there. I used to work for TCHC, okay, Toronto Community Housing." And Steve said, "Oh really? Well, what was your experience there?" He said, "Well, actually I got fired because I was critical about the gentrification and revitalization process. I was asking questions about it. And when they saw that I was giving them trouble and I wasn't going along with the plan, they accused me of being a member of Basics and they fired me." So you can see how powerful a tool something like Basics could be, right? It went into the community, it made Toronto Community Housing very scared, and they were accusing their own employees of being secret members of Basics, basically, to try and, disturb the harmony that they thought existed in the community. So, like I said, our work is ongoing. People in the community are aware of the paper. Some of them are using it to organize, but most importantly, the lessons we learned in Lawrence Heights are now being applied in other community organizing projects that Steve will tell you about, that Basics is supporting. I'm also going to end there and just mention that you're going to hear about some of the other campaigns we've supported and how Basics has been used in those campaigns. Just to mention, there's the Justice for Ugly campaign, and the newspaper was used widely as an organizing tool in that campaign, and same with the No Cops campaign.